Margaret Whittaker's heart pounded as she stepped into the oak-paneled conference room, gripping her son Sam's hand like a lifeline. The moment her polished leather shoes crossed the threshold, her sister Linda didn't even pause her sharp stare to offer a greeting. "Dad hated you," Linda snapped, her voice slicing through the hushed murmurs of distant cousins and family friends gathered around the long mahogany table. Sam's small hand trembled in hers, but he stayed close, his wide brown eyes reflecting a quiet determination beyond his 10 years. Margaret forced Sam into the chair at the far end, its vinyl-cushioned seat squeaking under his 8-year-old frame, and forced herself to swallow the pit of dread rising in her throat. Across the table, her Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair, cigar smoldering, sneering as if savoring her discomfort. Even the familiar scent of her father's old leather armchair still here, still waiting, couldn't mask the cold hostility radiating from everyone else. She hadn't planned to return to Willow Creek after packing up Sam and leaving town 8 years ago. Back then, she'd walked away from her father's silence and the crushing expectations of a marriage that refused to bend. But when the envelope from Mr. Parker, her father's lawyer, arrived 3 days after the funeral, Sam insisted they come. "Maybe there's something you need to hear," he'd said. And now, as Linda's red lipstick gleamed like war paint under the fluorescent lights, Margaret clung to that hope, fragile as it was, that her father had left one final message just for them. Margaret Whittaker felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she settled into her seat, but none were kind. Across the gleaming mahogany table, her Uncle Robert exhaled a plume of cigar smoke that hung heavy in the air, and with a disdainful chuckle he nodded toward her 9-year-old son. "Sam, even he knows you don't belong here," Robert muttered, the words sharp enough to cut through her composure. Beside him, Aunt Gloria leaned forward, her manicured nails tapping an impatient rhythm against the table's edge, while cousins and long-lost neighbors offered smirks of agreement. It was as though they'd rehearsed this moment for years, waiting for her to return so they could all stand in judgment. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and reminded herself to breathe in slowly through her nose. Sam's small hand tightened around hers beneath the table. His coppery hair swung gently as he shifted in his chair, but his eyes stayed level, focused straight ahead. Margaret could feel her pulse pulsing in her temples, that same familiar ache she'd carried for nearly a decade, the ache of shame and abandonment, of being told she was unworthy of her own family's love. Linda's voice cut in, cool and unrelenting. "Mother always said you were too fragile to handle the real world," she said. "Ran off at the first sign of trouble. Left your own child behind." Laughter rippled among the assembled relatives. Margaret's heart lurched. They'd even twisted the truth about Sam's infancy, blaming her for seeking safety during a marriage that had grown increasingly violent. She remembered the night she'd packed a single suitcase for herself and that baby boy, the roar of her husband's anger still echoing in her head. She had fled not out of weakness but survival, and now they branded it cowardice. A distant ceiling fan churned overhead, pushing the stale scent of cologne and cigar ash in lazy circles. Margaret could see the leather of the high-backed chairs worn thin at the armrests, the faded oil painting of her late father hanging on the far wall, its edges curling like secrets waiting to be unearthed. She'd once found comfort in this very room, the place where she'd celebrated birthdays and holiday dinners, but today it felt more like an arena where her character was on trial. As the attorney, Mr. Parker, cleared his throat to resume reading. Margaret forced her shoulders back. She reminded herself of the small victories she and Sam had built over the years, their cozy apartment filled with laughter, the weekends spent fishing on Lake Michigan, the summer barbecues with neighbors who cherished their friendship. These memories formed an invisible shield around her heart, stronger than any cruel words thrown in her direction. Uncle Robert leaned forward, his cigar stub pressed between his fingers. "Your father made it clear family sticks together," he said, voice dripping with accusation. "Not like some of us who abandon ship when things get tough." The room nodded in unison, as if recounting a shared history that excluded her. Margaret felt the hot sting of tears but clenched her jaw, determined not to give them the satisfaction of witnessing her tears. Beside her, Sam's hand remained steadfast, and Margaret realized that his calm confidence was her true inheritance. He'd known from the moment she arrived that things might turn ugly. Yet, here he sat steady, unwavering. In that instant, Margaret understood that her worth wasn't defined by the whispers or sneers of her relatives. It was defined by the courage it took to protect her child and the life she'd rebuilt. As Mr. Parker's voice floated back into her awareness, reading names and properties, Margaret lifted her chin. The hostility around her might fill the room, but it would not fill her spirit. Quietly, beneath the cacophony of judgment, she resolved that whatever came next, whatever cruel twists her family might unveil, she and Sam would face it together. And no matter how many times she'd been told she was worthless, Margaret Whitaker knew that in her son's eyes. She was everything. When Julia Lawrence stepped into the lawyer's conference room, tears threatened to Dua. 8 years ago, Margaret Whitaker stood on her front porch clutching a single worn suitcase, its leather handle slick with her tears. Behind her, the porch light flickered against the familiar white siding of her childhood home in suburban Chicago, a home that had once smelled of her mother's cinnamon rolls and her father's aftershave. But that night, the fragrance was tainted by silence and resentment. She could still hear the echo of her husband's raised voice booming through the hallway, each shouted word pounding in her ears like a hammer against an anvil. When he'd slammed the bedroom door behind him, it wasn't just a door he'd closed. It was every promise she had ever made to herself, every dream of a stable marriage she had ever nurtured. Margaret had spent years trying to make their marriage work. She had learned, the hard way, that love wasn't always enough to keep two people together. Week after week, she tiptoed around his moods, one day gentle as a summer breeze, the next day furious as a thunderstorm. She'd patched holes in his shirts and in his spirit, hoping to salvage their life together. But in the end, no amount of thread or tears could mend what had been broken. The final fracture came around midnight, when the glasses shattered on the floor and her son, Sam, only 2 at the time, woke to cry in confusion. In his wails, she heard her own heart break. The morning she left, Sam clung to her leg in matching pajamas, his small face streaked with oatmeal and tears. He didn't understand why Daddy had shouted or why Mommy's suitcase stood open by the door. He only knew her arms were the safest place in the world, and that he wanted to stay there forever. With trembling fingers, Margaret lifted him into her arms, feeling the reassuring weight of his head on her shoulder. She whispered a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I'll take care of you, no matter what." She drove across the Kishwaukee River as dawn broke, the sky a pale pink canvas that seemed to mock her heartbreak. She found an apartment in a quiet neighborhood near Evanston, where neighbors waved and offered pie, unaware of the storm she'd left behind. Day by day, she reconstructed their life, a modest 2-bedroom with vinyl floors she swept every morning, a small kitchen where she learned to roast chicken instead of relying on takeout, and a living room where Sam's laughter echoed off the walls like healing medicine. They had no grand possessions, but they had peace, and that pristine calm cost more than any inheritance. Yet, even as she built this new world, a hollow ache lingered in her chest. She missed her father, Charles Thomas, the stern patriarch who raised her to value loyalty above all else. She missed her sister, Linda, whose sharp wit once made her feel invincible. But she knew that returning to Willow Creek Park Road meant stepping back into a minefield of old resentments. At every family reunion, she'd felt the invisible sting of being the daughter who walked away. At church potlucks, whispers followed her through the buffet line. She abandoned the family. She couldn't handle hardship. She hurt her only son. Their pity was as cruel as any insult. For years, Margaret resisted every invitation to reconnect. She celebrated Sam's birthdays with his daycare friends. She watched him take his first wobbly steps and his first confident swings at t-ball games. She recorded milestone moments on her phone, his first bicycle ride, his graduation from 2nd grade, so she wouldn't miss a single memory. Yet every time the phone rang with an unknown number, her heart twisted with fear. What if it was Dad, demanding an explanation? What if it was Linda, calling to say she had no right to ask for forgiveness, so she let the calls go to voicemail, keeping her new life sealed off from the past? But when her father passed, the invitation arrived 3 days after his funeral, an envelope in crisp legal script, summoning her to the will reading. She tried to ignore it, but Sam, now 9, tugged at her sleeve with earnest eyes. "Mom," he said, "maybe there's something he left you," in his voice. She heard the same cautious hope she once had as a child on Christmas morning, and so she packed a fresh suitcase, braided Sam's copper hair tight against the wind, and drove back to the house she'd sworn never to enter again. In that moment, Margaret realized that sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones that lead us back home. She didn't know what awaited her behind those oak doors, but she knew she had to face it for herself, and for the boy who had become her world. The moment Mr. Parker, the family attorney, cleared his throat and flipped open the worn legal folder, a hush fell over the oak-paneled room. Margaret Whittaker straightened in her chair, her knuckles white around the edge of the velvet-cushioned armrest. Across the table, her sister Linda, immaculate in a tailored charcoal suit, exhaled a cold breath and offered Margaret a pitying smile. "Let us begin, Mr. Parker intoned, scanning the fine print under the soft glow of the chandelier. His voice was calm and unhurried, as though he were reading a grocery list rather than the final testament of their late father. "Charles Whittaker." He cleared his throat again and spoke the first bequest without hesitation. "I leave the family's primary residence at 1425 Maplewood Drive and all contents therein to my daughter, Linda Whittaker." At Linda's side, her husband, George, sat up straighter, a satisfied glint in his eyes. Margaret felt a cold twist in her stomach as she recalled childhood holidays spent beside that very fireplace, the place where her father taught her to ride her first bicycle in the driveway, and where he'd once read bedtime stories to Margaret and her sister. Now, that house, with its wrap-around porch and sprawling garden, would belong to Linda alone. Turning the page, Mr. Parker continued, I bequeath my interests in Whitaker & Sons Manufacturing, including all outstanding shares and profit distributions, to my son-in-law, Robert Bob Kent. Bob once merely her uncle leaned back, steepling his fingers, his cigar's fading ember still resting between his fingertips. The factory where Margaret had worked summers after high school, the dusty floors where her father had first taught her the value of hard work, now passed entirely into Kent's control, his fingers poised to reshape the business as he saw fit. Margaret's breath caught when Parker's voice dipped to the next clause, to my grandson, Peter Kent. I leave the complete vintage automobile collection housed at the family estate garage. Peter, seated beside his father. Peter's own children laughed softly in the corner, oblivious to the swirl of emotions at the table. The gleaming chrome cars restored 57 Chevrolets. A 64 Mustang convertible had once been a shared obsession of Margaret and her dad. As a girl, she had polished bumpers with him on Sunday mornings. Now they would belong to a boy barely old enough to understand their value. Page after page, Mr. Parker ticked off assets, artwork, stock portfolios, retirement annuities, each line reinforcing what Margaret already intuited. There was no mention of her name, no allocated portion of the estate, no footnote, no to my daughter, Margaret, or even a passing reference. Under the harsh clarity of that chandelier light, it was official her father's final word was that she was to receive nothing. A flutter of soft snickers rippled across the assembled cousins and family friends. Margaret felt the hot sting of humiliation rise to her cheeks. She squeezed her eyes shut for a moment, willing back the tears that threatened to spill. Only the faint click of Parker turning a page reminded her to keep herself together. She could not afford to crumble here, not in front of Linda's smug satisfaction, not in front of Bob's triumphant grin, and not in front of the neighbors who'd once nodded politely at Thanksgiving dinners, but now looked upon her with the same disdain. As Parker closed the folder, Margaret took a steadying breath. The room seemed to contract around her, every particle of dust in the stale air, every reflection in the polished table surface, every frayed edge on the velvet chairs now screamed the same verdict: she had been erased. Yet even amidst the shock and the injustice, a small, fierce spark ignited within her. This initial reading of the will was meant to wound, to finalize her exile, but she would not permit it to define her worth. With her son Sam's hand gently gripping hers under the table, Margaret resolved that what she had built in 8 years, peace, love, unwavering devotion, was more valuable than any house, business share, or vintage car. And no legal document could ever take that away. Margaret Whitaker sat rigidly in her seat as the last echoes of Mr. Parker's voice faded into the heavy silence of the mahogany-paneled room. She had steeled herself for humiliation, had braced for each familiar name to fall, one by one, onto her exclusion, but nothing prepared her for the moment that followed. Across the table, her Uncle Robert's cigar smoke haze curled toward the ceiling as he leaned back, a self-satisfied smirk spreading on his lips. Her sister Linda sat poised in her tailored gray suit, red lipstick still gleaming, as if she were about to take a bow after a particularly deft performance. Margaret's pulse drummed in her ears, and she closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, willing the room to spin back in her favor. But then her son, Sam, just 10 years old, shifted in his chair. His chair squeaked under his weight. the vinyl cushion groaning in protest, and Margaret felt his small hand slip into hers beneath the table. He looked up at her, those earnest brown eyes shining with a calm she hadn't known she needed. And then, in a voice clear enough for every person in the room to hear, he spoke 4 simple words. "You forgot the video." A collective gasp rose from the assembled relatives. Linda's perfectly arched eyebrow shot upward. Robert's cigar halted mid-drag. Even Mr. Parker paused, pen poised over the legal folder as though uncertain whether to continue. Margaret stared at Sam, confusion and awe mingling in her chest. "Sam," she whispered, barely more than a breath. But Sam was already reaching into his small backpack, pulling out a white envelope sealed at the flap. His name, Margaret Whitaker, was written across the front in his grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. Letters in all capitals for the lawyer only if it gets ugly. The envelope trembled slightly in Sam's grip, but he didn't flinch. He placed it on the table with deliberate care, and Margaret felt a tremor of hope ripple through her. The past 8 years had been defined by noise shouts, accusations, cold shoulders. But here was something quiet, something deliberate, something that might finally speak the truth her family refused to acknowledge. "Mr. Parker cleared his throat, his practiced calm returning like a tide. "I counsel. May I, he asked, his voice softer now, touched with something like curiosity. Sam nodded and slid the envelope toward the lawyer. Margaret's heart hammered as Mr. Parker broke the seal, peeling back the paper to reveal a small black USB drive nestled inside, and a folded sheet of stationery bearing her father's familiar scrawl. The attorney's brow furrowed as he unfolded the letter. "Per my instructions," he read aloud, "this video message from Charles Whitaker is to be played only if the will reading becomes contentious." His voice held an undercurrent of astonishment. He tapped the USB drive gently, as if it were about to explode. Meanwhile, every pair of eyes in the room had turned to Sam, half in admiration, half in disbelief. It was the boy who had carried this moment into being, the boy who had seen past the bitterness of adults and honored his mother's right to be heard. Across from Margaret, Linda's face paled. She exchanged a glance with Robert, whose cigar smoldered down to its last inch. Linda opened her mouth as if to protest, but no words came. The room was charged with expectation. Even the air felt thick, as though every swirl of perfume, every whisper of leather and oak, had been paused in anticipation. "Mr. Parker closed his eyes for a beat, then reached for the sleek laptop resting on the corner of the table. He plugged in the USB drive, and the screen flickered to life. Margaret gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles whitening as a black frame appeared, bearing her father's name and a single button labeled Play. She glanced down at Sam, whose gaze was steady. He pressed the button, and suddenly, there he was, Charles Whitaker. Older, thinner, wearing the navy blue sweater Margaret had once knitted for him. He looked directly into the camera, eyes softened by regret and love. Margaret's breath caught. The room's hostility dissolved into riveted silence. Every sneer, every whispered insult, every dismissive glance vanished beneath the weight of her father's voice. Sam sat forward, entirely still, his small chest rising and falling in time with each word that came through the computer's speakers. In that moment, his quiet courage had shifted the balance of power. He had given Margaret back her voice, and with it, the promise that her father's final testament would be more than the empty lines of an unjust will. As the video began, Margaret let her eyes close for just a second. She felt Sam's hand tighten around hers, a grounding force that reminded her no matter what followed, they faced it together. In the hush that followed Sam's bold intervention, Margaret realized that sometimes the smallest among us can carry the heaviest truths, and that love, even in the form of a 10-year-old's bravery, can rewrite the story we thought was already written. Margaret Whittaker barely registered the words when her 10-year-old son Sam announced, "You forgot the video." In the hush that followed, Linda's painted lips parted in disbelief, and Uncle Robert's cigar wavered between his fingers. Margaret's pulse thundered as she watched Sam reach into his small backpack and extract a plain white envelope stamped in her father's unmistakable handwriting. "For the lawyer only if it gets ugly." His calm, deliberate movement seemed almost otherworldly against the swirl of anger and shame she had braced herself to endure. The envelope lay on the polished mahogany table as though it had been waiting there all along. Margaret's throat went dry. The room, heavy with the scent of cigar smoke. Chanel gnome, 5 in old wood polish, seemed to inhale in collective anticipation. Mr. Parker, her father's lawyer, stole a glance at the seal, then at Sam's steady brown eyes. For a moment, the stoic facade of authority the lawyer had worn throughout the reading cracked ever so slightly. He cleared his throat. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the envelope. Sam nodded, and Mr. Parker carefully slipped his fingers beneath the flap. The paper crackled softly as he unfolded a folded sheet of stationery bearing the familiar letterhead of Charles Whittaker's law office. Underneath it, nestled in a precision-cut slot, was a small black USB drive. The metal connector gleamed coldly in the overhead light. Margaret felt as though the ground had tilted beneath her. For 8 years, she had carried the ache of being disowned, of her father's silence, of her family's whispered judgments. Yet here, resting against that crisp white page, lay the promise of truth, something her relatives had tried so hard to bury. "Mr. Parker unfolded the letter and read it aloud in measured tones. "Should this will reading become adversarial, my final wishes include a video message sealed until such a moment. My daughter Margaret and grandson Samuel deserve my last words, no matter how contentious the proceedings." The sentence lingered longer than it needed to, as though the lawyer fully grasped the gravity of what he was delivering. A hush fell deeper than any the room had known. Margaret caught Linda's hand reflexively twitch toward her clutch purse. Uncle Robert's shoulders stiffened, cigar ash shaking free onto the floor. "Mr. Parker glanced at the assembled relatives, then back to the letter. "This letter is signed and dated, and the USB drive is time-stamped with an official notary seal," he explained. "I have verified both. Under my legal obligation, I must play this video." He rose smoothly, nearly as if guided by a hidden mechanism, and moved to the laptop perched at the head of the table. Courteously, he tipped his hat to the family before plugging in the drive. The laptop's fan whirred as the screen flickered to life with the title card. Final message from Charles Whittaker. The blue play button glowed, and even Linda seemed unable to look away. Margaret's gaze found Sam's. His small hand was steady on her knee, offering a wordless encouragement. She swallowed, inhaling the tension that filled the space between them. As the video began, her father's voice echoed through the room, as real and gentle as she remembered from her childhood. But for the relatives around her, the moment carried sharper edges. Linda's red lipstick had faded at the corners, and Robert was gripping the armrests of his chair. The older cousins leaned forward, confusion flickering across their faces. The polished floorboards creaked under their shuffling feet. For Margaret, time slowed. Each word her father spoke his apologies for misunderstanding her, his pride in her strength, his explanation of why he waited until it got ugly to reveal the video seemed to stitch her fractured heart back together. She felt Sam's fingers squeeze hers, a tiny anchor in a storm of emotion. As the final frame of the video faded to black, silence reigned. No one moved. No one spoke. The USB drive lay inert beside the letter, yet its impact was electric, rewriting not only the terms of a will, but the story of a family's love and loss. In that charged quiet, Margaret understood that her worth had never been defined by assets or by cold legal language. It had always been in her father's voice, preserved on that drive, waiting until the moment it mattered most. Margaret's breath caught as the grainy image of her father filled the laptop screen. Charles Whitaker sat behind his familiar oak desk, the well-worn leather surface etched with decades of family history, Christmas gifts wrapped there, summer maps spread out for fishing trips, late-night letters penned in Margaret's shaky teenage handwriting. He wore the navy cardigan she had knitted for him last Christmas, an ironic reminder that he had never once mentioned it. His eyes, rimmed with age and regret, met the camera with a vulnerability Margaret had never seen in life. "Hello, my Julia," he began, and even that softened inflection of her childhood nickname struck Margaret like a benediction. "If you're watching this, I'm gone, and I know things got ugly today." She glanced at Sam, whose small hand rested on hers under the table, steady as ever. Across the room, even Linda's perfunctory cough seemed hushed. Her father paused, swallowing as if the memory pained him. "I spent too many years believing I was right, believing that leaving meant betrayal, and that being proud meant never showing weakness. I failed you both. I failed to see the courage it took for you to leave and protect that precious boy. My grandson." Margaret's eyes stung as his words washed over her. She had carried the weight of his silence for almost a decade. Now, here was his voice carved into time, acknowledging her sacrifice. Charles's shoulders slumped as he continued. "I've always admired your strength, Julia. Even if I never said it. I thought strength meant standing firm, but real strength is showing up protecting the ones you love, even when it's hard. And you did that. You gave Sam a life filled with laughter and safety. And for that, I am proud." A tremor of relief loosened Margaret's clenched jaw. It was as though the years of unspoken guilt and resentment evaporated in that quiet room. He cleared his throat and shifted in his chair, the camera angle revealing a legal binder stamped with the Whitaker seal. "Because family means more than blood. I have amended my final wishes," he said. "Margaret, the house at Maplewood Drive. Your childhood home is now yours and Sam's. The retirement accounts, the checking and savings, everything I had set aside for myself, I leave to you. And for Sam, I've established a college trust, no strings attached. Just an investment in his future." As he spoke each bequest, Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders melt. The very assets Linda and Robert had claimed with smug entitlement were reunited with their true heirs, the daughter and grandson her father had loved all along. He leaned forward, eyes earnest, and added, "I know this can't repair the years I lost, but I wanted you to have the peace and security I couldn't give you before I was gone. Never doubt that I loved you and that I always will." The final words drifted from the speaker in a tremulous whisper. "Take care of Sam. Thank him for me. And Julia, thank you for being the daughter I couldn't be proud of until it was too late." Then the screen faded to black. Silence reigned in the conference room. Chairs creaked. A door clicked softly, and Margaret felt Sam's hand squeeze hers with gentle pride. In that moment, the legacy of love her father had finally declared echoed louder than any legal document ever could. An affirmation that truth, when spoken, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Margaret sat frozen as the final frame of her father's video flickered to black. The soft click of the USB drive being ejected echoing louder than any voice in the room. For a heartbeat, there was nothing but thick, almost reverent silence, no snide comments, no shifting feet, no mechanical rustle of legal papers. It felt as though time itself had paused to honor the truth that had just been spoken. Then the dam broke. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth, and tears welled in her eyes, spilling over in hot, unbidden rivulets that traced tracks down her cheeks. Her shoulders shook as the weight she'd carried for 8 years of shame, self-doubt, and the pain of being disowned crumbled into dust. Each tear seemed to wash away a layer of the old story she'd been forced to live. The narrative that labeled her abandoning daughter and unworthy mother. In that moment, her father's voice, warm and regretful, became the anthem of her redemption. "I am proud of you," he had said. "I love you." Those words reverberated through her chest like a healing balm. Across the table, Linda sat utterly still, her crimson lipstick smudged at the corners where she'd pinched her lips so tightly. The cold superiority that had radiated from her moments before was now replaced by something unreadable, perhaps shock, perhaps guilt. Uncle Robert had slid his cigar into an ashtray without so much as a puff, and his usual smug grin had vanished, leaving his jaw clenched in an awkward attempt to hold on to dignity. Even Mr. Parker, the composed lawyer who'd presided over the entire ordeal, remained at the head of the table, his hand hovering over the mouse as if afraid to close the laptop and break the sacred hush. Margaret let out a small, strangled laugh, a sound of disbelief and relief tangled together. She felt Sam's tiny hand slip into hers beneath the table, anchoring her to the here and now. He gave her a gentle squeeze, his own eyes glistening but steadfast. At 10 years old, he'd shown more courage in the last few minutes than any adult in the room had displayed in a lifetime. His quiet act of faith in her and in his grandfather's final wish had rewritten their fate. As the tears slowed and her breathing evened, Margaret realized that the oppressive heat of the mahogany-paneled room had given way to a soft, almost tangible calm. The hostility that had crushed her spirit just moments before now seemed inconsequential, like a cruel dream dissipating with the dawn. She raised her head and met her relative's eyes, first Linda's, then Robert's, then the cousin's, and found no malice there. Only an awkward recognition that the truth they'd conspired to bury had surfaced unavoidably. No one spoke, They offered no apologies, no explanations. Yet the silence between them felt less like judgment and more like mutual acknowledgement the story was over. And there was nothing left to say. A single chair creaked as Linda rose, her posture stiff and uncertain. Without a word, she collected her purse and swept out of the room, followed closely by Uncle Robert, whose shoulders sagged as he finally exhaled. Margaret watched them go, feeling neither triumph nor vindictiveness, only the quiet satisfaction of someone who has finally been heard. When the last door clicked shut, only Margaret, Sam, and Mr. Parker remained. The lawyer closed the folder and slid it across the table with respectful gentleness. "Everything is in order," he said softly, offering Margaret a small, empathetic smile. She nodded, blinking back the last of her tears. The room felt unexpectedly large without the weight of dozens of eyes on her back. Margaret stood, her legs a little unsteady but her heart undeniably lighter. She walked to the window and looked out over the manicured lawn that had once symbolized her family's pride. Now it stretched before her like a blank page, waiting for new memories to be written. Sam bounded up beside her, his small frame radiating quiet triumph. "We did it. Mom," he whispered, his voice brimming with a child's simple faith in right and wrong. Margaret knelt and hugged him, breathing in the scent of his shampoo and clean clothes. "Yes. Sweetheart," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We did it together, in that embrace." All the fear and loneliness of the past 8 years melted away. The emptiness she had felt since leaving home was replaced by a profound sense of belonging first to her son, and now, finally, to the truth of her own story. As they turned to leave, Margaret felt her father's words echo once more in her mind. "Never doubt that I loved you and that I always will." She walked out of that room not as the discarded daughter they had expected, but as a woman reclaimed by love, fortified by her son's loyalty, and forever changed by the healing power of her father's final testament. Margaret's hands still trembled as she stepped out of that silent room, her father's final words echoing like a heartbeat in her chest. "I am proud of you, and I love you," in that moment. She realized that the true legacy we pass on isn't houses or bank accounts, but the courage to stand up for ourselves and the love that binds us across generations. Life will inevitably bring moments of rejection and pain, but it's in those very moments that our resilience shines brightest. When Margaret walked back into the light, she carried with her not just her son Sam's steady grip, but a renewed faith in the power of truth and forgiveness. For anyone watching who's ever felt invisible or unappreciated, especially those of us with a few more years behind us, remember this. Your story matters. It's never too late to reclaim your voice, to heal old wounds, and to build something beautiful from the ashes of past hurt. Whether you're navigating a difficult family dynamic or simply seeking the courage to speak your truth, know that you are not alone, and that sometimes the tiniest act of bravery can change everything. If Margaret and Sam's journey touched your heart, please share your own story in the comments below. What truths have you uncovered later in life? How did you find the strength to forgive or to stand firm in your worth? And if you believe in the healing power of real, raw, emotional stories, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a heartfelt tale that reminds us all you are seen, you are valued, and your voice matters.